The Crowd by Gustave Le Bon. Wikipedia describes Gustave Le Bon as a French polymath. A polymath is someone who is learned or skilled in numerous different areas. He was a French polymath whose areas of interest included anthropology, psychology, sociology, medicine, invention, and physics. So basically, like minus the art, a Da Vinci of his era. He is best known for his 1895 work entitled The Crowd, The Study of the Popular Mind, which is considered one of the seminal works on crowd psychology. And that's what we'll be diving into this video, his work, The Crowd. Now, Le Bon was born in 1841 and he died in 1931. So he lived to the age of 90, pretty much had a full life, what anyone could hope for. So the book starts off with the era of the crowds. The era of the crowds. The only important changes whence the renewal of civilization results affect ideas, conceptions, and beliefs. The memorable events of history are the visible effects of the invisible changes of human thought. The reason these great events are so rare is that there is nothing so stable in a race as the inherited groundwork of its thoughts. So he's talking about these great ideas that come along only so rarely in human history. That usually the changing of a whole civilization and their beliefs and their traditions, it happens so rarely because the people, typically before modernity, were so embedded in their traditions and their cultures, it organically grew up with them as they grew up as a people. So it's rare these big events happen, but they do happen. And when this book was being written, he's speaking about the era that it's happening in the 1800s. He goes on to explain this now. The present epoch is one of these critical moments in which the thought of mankind is undergoing a process of transformation. Two fundamental factors are at the base of this transformation. The first is the destruction of those religious, political, and social beliefs in which all the elements of our civilization are rooted. The second is the creation of an entirely new conditions of existence and thought as the results of modern scientific and industrial discoveries. While all our ancient beliefs are tottering and disappearing, while the old pillars of society are giving way one by one, the power of the crowd is the only force that nothing menaces, and of which the prestige is continually on the increase. The age we are about to enter will in truth be the era of the crowds. Scarcely a century ago, now he's writing this in 1895, so in the late 1700s, scarcely a century ago, the traditional policy of European states and the rivalries of sovereigns were the principal factors that shaped events. The opinion of the masses scarcely counted, and most frequently indeed did not count at all. Today, it is the traditions which used to obtain politics and the individual tendencies and rivalries of the rulers which do not count. While, on the contrary, the voice of the masses has become preponderant. It is this voice that dictates their conduct to kings, whose endeavor is to take note of its utterances. The destinies of nations are elaborated at present in the heart of the masses, and no longer in the councils of the princes. The divine right of the masses is about to replace the divine right of kings. So, all of European tradition is changing now. Everything's being whittled away. As you said, the destruction of religious, political, and social beliefs are all disappearing. A society that was run by nobilities is now going to be run by the crowd. We should know that's a smokescreen in itself too. There's always going to be there's always going to be a select elite. It's just who it's going to be, and underneath the crowd, quote unquote, the crowd, the select elite is going to be the people that pander to them, feed their vices. As it'll be explained throughout this video and his work, why so the crowd is easy to be swayed by such methods. But something interesting here, because as Le Bon's saying, it's rare that these great civilization changing moments come about in man. So what brings this one on? And part of it, which he states, and I think it is accurate, is the advance of science and the industrial revolution as well. I mean, these obviously play a factor in the change, but there's something else, and he doesn't quite see it, or at least speak on it, but it's there. It's there. Because quite a coincidence that, as he's saying, a century ago, the old traditions held up, and now all of a sudden they're being destroyed. Well, what else happened? What else was a big change in European society, around the late 1700s and into the 1800s and mid 1800s, all the way to this point of 1895 when he's writing this? Well, alongside the Industrial Revolution, alongside, we can also throw in there the advance of capitalism, and alongside the science revolution, we also have the emancipation of the Jewish people into Europe. And this does, in fact, play a role. It's not just, as some people try to write it off as, this irrational anti Semitism expressed by people. You'll even notice people who are, race realists come out there and try to write off anti Semitism as some kind of irrational hatred. But no, there's a reality to this. Le Bon is speaking about the destruction of society as the Europeans know it. Then we have to look at the reasons for this. And when we look at what we've already learned from Maurice Samuel and many other Jewish people, what we've already learned from Werner Sumbart's Jews in Modern Capitalism, that in effect it is to their advantage to remold society to their strengths. So let's look at the years when Jews became equally, through the law, legal citizens in the countries they inhabited. Well, we see right away France, 1791. 1791, they were granted equal rights as a French citizen. That means all the doors were open to them. And we also see, and we can go down the list here. We can go down the list all throughout inside Europe, all throughout the 1800s. We see them becoming legal citizens. Now, is that a coincidence? This epoch of society changing, of civilization changing, that is so rare in human history, these major changes, these changes of not just certain cultures and traditions, not just little traditions dying out, the change of the worldview of the whole society and civilization, the changing of the direction of that civilization. Massive changes. Is it any coincidence that we have, the usual suspects, essentially? I mean, we can see it for ourselves. And then, just scratching the surface on this topic, we even go look at the media of their time. Because, how do you mold a people? It's obviously through the media. It's through what they see and what they hear and what they learn. We see even, the famous, most popular newspapers of the time, like the Le Petit Journal, owned by who? You know who. You know who, don't you? It's all obvious. It's a little redundant at this point, but just merely scratching the surface. We see the newspaper owners, and then out of the four they list here, we have another one. How would you say that? Le Matin. Matin. However, the same thing here. It's a little shady. A group of American financiers. We know how that goes. All out of New York, I'd suspect. I'm sure they were as American as Alexander Hamilton was. But so we see the media, the methods of molding people in the hands of certain people. Then we go look at the stars of that time as well. You have the Sarah Bernhardt, who was, as Wikipedia states, the most famous actress the world had ever known, and is regarded as one of the finest actors of all time. Yes. Was one of 6 children of a Jewish merchant. Yeah, so we see the major stars and, the media at the time, your usual story. That's why this people that write this anti-Semitism off as irrational, well, this is a contributing factor. It is no coincidence that this epoch of civilization change is also coincided with Jews becoming full citizens in these countries, and as well as Jews as dominating and gaining superiority in media and the means and methods of molding people. But it's an irrational, right? We're talking about 1800s France and Europe here. That has no parallels to America today.
I'm not sure that there was an, quote, American dream before the Jews came to Hollywood and invented it. What you had was a westward movement, and you had the idea of freedom, but you didn't have what we have today, which is a popular culture that creates dreams. That's a dream factory.
They created their own America, an America which is not the real America. It's their own version of the real America. But ultimately, this shadow America becomes so popular and so widely disseminated that its images and its values come to devour the real America. And so the grand irony of all of Hollywood is that Americans come to define themselves by the shadow America that was created by Eastern European Jewish immigrants.
Yeah. Now, see, they can say that. That's fine for them to say that. But if you were to repeat exactly what they just said right there in that clip from An Empire of Their Own, you'd be called an irrational anti-Semite, my friend. But anyways, I won't go off on this detour too much. I just saw the obvious connection there, and it's something Le Bon did not dive into. Maybe completely unaware of it, or completely dismissive of it, or for whatever reason. But there is a connection there. All right, so let us continue on. History tells us that from the moment when the moral forces on which the civilization rested have lost their strength, its final dissolution is brought about by those unconscious and brutal crowds known justifiably enough as barbarians. Civilizations, as yet, have only been created and directed by a small intellectual aristocracy, never by crowds. Crowds are only powerful for destruction. Their rule is always tantamount to a barbarian phase. A civilization involves fixed rules, discipline, a passing from the instinctive to the rational state, forethought for the future, an elevated degree of culture. All of them conditions that the crowds, left to themselves, have invariably shown themselves incapable of realizing. That's quite the thrashing of democracy right there. And we're going to go into why he's saying this. He's not just saying, hey, crowds are primitive and stupid for a reason. He's going to break down as to exactly why he has these beliefs. So let's get into a little bit of that. We go into the mind of crowds. General characteristics of crowds, psychological law, and their mental unity. Whatever nationality, profession, or sex, and whatever be the chances that have brought them together, from the psychological point of view, the expression crowd assumes quite a different signification. Under certain given circumstances, and only under those circumstances, an agglomeration of men presents new characteristics very different from those of the individuals composing it. You lose yourself in the crowd. The sentiments and ideas of all the persons in the gathering take one and the same direction, and their conscious personality vanishes. A collective mind is formed, doubtless transitory, but presenting very clearly defined characteristics. The gathering has thus become what, in the absence of a better expression, I will call an organized crowd, or, if the term is considered preferable, a psychological crowd. It forms a single being, and is subjected to the law of the mental unity of crowds. It is evident that it is not by the mere fact of a number of individuals finding themselves accidentally side by side that they acquire the character of an organized crowd. 1,000 individuals accidentally gathered in a public place without any determined object in no way constitute a crowd from the psychological point of view. To acquire the special characteristics of such a crowd, the influence is necessary of certain predisposing causes, of which we shall have to determine the nature. So to get the psychological effect of the crowd, or the unity of the crowd, you have to first be gathered for some sort of commonality to begin with. You're all going to the same metal show. You're all going to see the same politician speak. Whatever it may be, that has to be some kind of underlying factor that brings everyone there. This very fact that crowds possess in common ordinance qualities explains why they can never accomplish acts demanding a high degree of intelligence. Different causes determine the appearance of these characteristics peculiar to crowds and not possessed by isolated individuals. The first is that the individual forming part of the crowd acquires solely from numerical considerations a sentiment of invincible power which allows him to yield to his instincts, which, had he been alone, he would prefer to have kept under restraint. So that unity brings people a sense of invincibility when you're in a crowd of people who share the same beliefs as you. It gives you this strength, or at least this feeling of strength. You may become more brave or even more reckless to your own detriment. He will be the less disposed to check himself from the consideration that a crowd being anonymous and in consequence irresponsible, the sentiment of responsibility which always controls individuals disappears entirely. Looting's a perfect example of that. You know, these crowds get together and they quote unquote protest and demonstrate, and they start feeling like they can get away with anything. But hey, look, it's hundreds of us doing this. How are they going to catch us? And they get this feeling of invincibility and immunity to the law, and start breaking in stores and just grabbing what they want. The second cause, which is contagion, also intervenes to determine the manifestation in crowds of their special characteristics, and at the same time the trend they are to take. Contagion is a phenomenon of which it is easy to establish the presence, but that is not easy to explain. It must be classed among those phenomena of a hypnotic order. So this contagion he's talking about, that's in the sales community, they call that a feeding frenzy. There was a period of time where, I had to take a job doing door-to-door sales, and a part of the training was trying to get a feeding frenzy going, and that means like going into a bar and getting, trying to sell something to one person in the bar, and if you could do that, that'd start a crowd, to come around and maybe start purchasing as well. That's that contagion. So it's the same thing, just different application to it. In a crowd, every sentiment and act is contagious, and contagious to such a degree that an individual readily sacrifices his personal interest to the collective interest. This is an aptitude very contrary to his nature, and of which a man is scarcely capable except when he makes part of a crowd. A third cause, and by far the most important, determines in the individuals of a crowd special characteristics which are quite contrary at times to those presented by the isolated individual. I allude that suggestibility of which, moreover, the contagion mentioned above is neither more nor less than an effect. We see, then, that the disappearance of the conscious personality, the predominance of the unconscious personality, the turning by means of suggestion and contagion of feelings and ideas in an identical direction, the tendency to immediately transform the suggested idea into acts. These, we see, are the principal characteristics of the individual forming part of the crowd. He is no longer himself, but has become an automation who has ceased to be guided by his will. Moreover, by the mere fact that he forms part of an organized crowd, a man descends several rungs into the ladder of civilization. Isolated, he may be a cultivated individual. In a crowd, he is a barbarian. That is, a creature acting by instinct. He possesses the spontaneity, the violence, the ferocity, and also the enthusiasm and heroism of primitive beings. whom he further tends to resemble by the facility with which he allows himself to be impressed by words and images, which would be entirely without action on each of the isolated individuals composing the crowd, and to be induced to commit acts contrary to his most obvious interests and his best known habits. An individual in a crowd is a grain of sand amid other grains of sand, which the wind stirs up at will. The sentiments and morality of crowds. Number 1. Impulsiveness, mobility, and the irritability of crowds. When studying the fundamental characteristics of a crowd, we stated that it is guided almost exclusively by unconscious motives. Its acts are far more under the influence of the spinal cord than the brain. In this respect, a crowd is closely akin to quite primitive beings. The acts performed may be perfect so far as their execution is concerned, but as they are not directed by the brain, the individual conducts himself according as the excited causes to which he is submitted may happen to decide. A crowd is at the mercy of all external exciting causes and reflects their incessant variations. It is the slave of the impulses which it receives. The isolated individual may be submitted to the same exciting causes as the man in the crowd, but as his brain shows him the inadvisability of yielding to them, he refrains from yielding. This truth may be psychologically expressed by saying that the isolated individual possesses the capacity of dominating his reflex actions, while the crowd is devoid of this capacity. Number 2. The suggestibility and credulity of the crowds. However indifferent it may be supposed, a crowd, as a rule, is in a state of expectant attention, which renders suggestion easy. The first suggestion formulated which arises implants itself immediately by a process of contagion in the brains of all assembled, and the identical bent of the sentiments of the crowd is immediately an accomplished fact. As is the case with all persons under the influence of suggestion, the idea which has entered the brain tends to transform itself into an act. Whether the act is that of setting fire to a palace or involves self-sacrifice, a crowd lends itself to it with equal facility. All will depend on the nature of the exciting cause, and no longer, as in the case of the isolated individual, on the relations existing between the act suggested and the sum total of the reasons which may be urged against its realization. In consequence, a crowd perpetually hovering on the borderland of unconsciousness, readily yielding to all suggestion, having all the violence of feeling peculiar to beings who cannot appeal to the influence of reason, deprived of all critical faculty, cannot be otherwise than excessively credulous. The improbable does not exist for a crowd. 3. The exaggeration and ingenuousness of the sentiments of the crowd. Whether the feelings exhibited by a crowd be good or bad, they present the double character of being very simple and very exaggerated. On this point, and on so many others, an individual in a crowd resembles primitive beings. Inaccessible to the fine distinctions, he sees things as a whole and is blind to their immediate phases. The exaggeration of the sentiments of a crowd is heightened by the fact that any feeling, when once it is exhibited, communicating itself very quickly by a process of suggestion and contagion, the evident approbation of which it is the object considerably increases its force. The simplicity and exaggeration of the sentiments of the crowd have for result that a thong knows neither doubt or uncertainty. Like women, it goes once to the extremes. And there was a part in the book, I didn't add it to this video, where he likened the crowd, it was basically feministic. And this is why he says that, because it's heavily built on emotion. It goes from one extreme to the next, depending on who or what is swaying it in whichever way. So he says, like women, it goes at once to extremes. A suspicion transforms itself as soon as announced into incontrovertible evidence. A commencement of antipathy or disapprobation, which in the case of an isolated individual would not gain strength, becomes at once furious hatred in the case of an individual in the crowd. The violence of the feelings of the crowd are also increased, especially in a heterogeneous crowd, by the absence of the sense of responsibility. The certainty of impunity, a certainty the stronger as the crowd is more numerous, and the notion of a considerable monetary force due to number, make possible in the case of crowds sentiments and acts impossible for the isolated individual. In crowds, the foolish, ignorant, and envious persons are freed from the sense of their insignificance and powerlessness, and are possessed instead by the notion of a brutal and temporary but immense strength. Unfortunately, this tendency of crowds towards exaggeration is often brought to bear upon the bad sentiments. So the crowd pretty much goes into an equal denominator, and it's our primitive base instincts, not our logical or rational side. And he's saying, once the crowd is at this primitive state, it can be used for any, numerous reasons. Today, we see, usually when there's gathering of crowds, there's people, they're not calling for violence. In any of these crowds you see, you hardly see that the organizers or main speakers are inciting violence amongst the crowd. It's actually the opposite. Whenever violence or vandalism or something comes about from the crowd, there are people trying to suppress that, saying, oh, no, you don't want the cameras to see this, whatever they're saying, they're trying to get people in check. Not to, because violence is looked down upon in our society right now. It's a very brutish, savage thing. It's below our ethics of today. Our ethics are today, that are promoted at least, are very pacifistic in nature. Don't burn down the city. Just hold up signs, displaying your contempt or your grievances with the system or whatever you're protesting against. So we're in a stage where violence is not being called upon these crowds. But I do think we are heading to an era where violence again will become talking points of these crowds. Violence again will be encouraged in crowds to come. So, and the results of that will be an enthusiastic, violent crowd, of course, because as Le Bon's telling us, in the crowd, that common denominator amongst the crowd is everyone going to their base instincts and being swayed by the suggestion of the organizer, the speaker, whoever is at the head of the crowd, whoever the crowd has opened their ears for the suggestion to take place. These sentiments are atavistic residuum of the instincts of the primitive man, which the fear of punishment obliges the isolated and responsible individual to curb. Thus, it is that crowds are so easily led into the worst excesses. Still, this does not mean that crowds, skillfully influenced, are not capable of heroism and devotion and of evincing the loftiest virtues. They are even more capable of showing these qualities than the isolated individual. So once again, it could go either way. It depends on who is creating the suggestion that the crowd is listening to. And this whole book and his whole work is not an attack on the crowd. You could say it's an attack on democracy because it highlights the absurdity of the mass making decisions on the advancements and progress of a nation, because the mass will always be at their base instincts, and we'll have what goes on today, politicians pandering to these base instincts and a society built around the vice industry. Given to exaggeration in his feelings, a crowd is only impressed by the excessive sentiments. An orator wishing to move a crowd must make an abusive use of violent affirmation. To exaggerate, to affirm, to resort to repetitions, and never to attempt to prove anything by reasoning, are methods of argument well known to speakers at public meetings. That's a reality that it's a hard pill to swallow, because you would like to think you can get in front of 20,000 people, 100,000 people, and just speak truthfully, rationally from the heart, and explain to people, all the detailed layers of this problem and that problem and your beliefs on them, and how to and why and all to go about these things. But unfortunately, that's not the case. You have to simplify your message. You have to repeat it. I mean, there is a speaking propaganda technique to reaching the crowd, and it's unfortunate that it's that way. But even if you have a virtuous message to bring forth, you have to package it the right way, or no one's going to listen. It's not going to work. It's not going to get the results that you want. So it's a shitty game, but all public speakers have to play it because it is what it is. That's, you wish it was something different, but we see all throughout history and modern day the same recipe works for public speaking and propaganda and getting people to support or go against something. It has to be basic and vague. A mythology has to be created in most cases. I mean, at least that's the most powerful fuel for people. So it's unfortunate, but that's it. And you'd have to, and if you desire being a good public speaker, you have to hone these skills of speaking. Like he says here, going back to the quote we just read, given to the exaggeration in his feelings, a crowd is only impressed by excessive sentiments. An orator wishing to move a crowd must make an abusive use of violent affirmations. This is a perfect example of Hitler. He used to practice movements before speeches, and he'd go through speeches and practice the exact movements and the way he was going to say something. And his speeches always had a crescendo. It was always building to this crescendo. And he just had the crowd eating out of his hand the whole time. And he had to work at it. He had to spend hours practicing his speeches and poses and figuring out what worked best and tying them together, speech after speech after speech, using what works one night, the next night in a different town, and using what, or disregarding what didn't work, and as he goes on to the next town for the next speech. And this is all good speakers will practice these things, their mannerisms and everything. And, it's unfortunate for us that, today, like the politicians, they're told to restrain their mannerisms. Like the more animated you are, the more, oh, he's a wild man, they push across. There's very, they have these very limited hand gestures that seem to be approved, talking method of politicians today. I'm not sure what's behind that, but I'm sure there's definitely a reason for it. All right, let's go on. Number 4, the intolerance, dictatorialness, and conservatism of crowds. Crowds are only cognizant of simple and extreme sentiments. The opinions, ideas, and beliefs suggested to them are accepted or rejected as a whole, and considered as absolute truths or as not less absolute errors. This is always the case with beliefs induced by a process of suggestion instead of engendered by reasoning. Everyone is aware of the intolerance that accompanies religious beliefs and of the despotic empire they exercise on men's minds. Authoritativeness and intolerance are sentiments of which crowds have very clear notion, which they easily conceive and which they entertain as readily as they put them in practice when once they are imposed upon them. Crowds exhibit a docile respect for force, and are but slightly impressed by kindness, which for them is scarcely other than a form of weakness. Their sympathies have never been bestowed on easygoing masters, but on tyrants who vigorously oppress them. It is to these latter that they always erect the loftiest statues. It is true that they are willing to trample on a despot whom they have stripped of his power, but it is because, having lost his strength, he has resumed his place among the feeble, who are to be despised because they are not to be feared. The type of hero dear to crowds will always have the semblance of a Caesar. His insignia attracts them, his authority overawes them, and his sword instills them with fear. So the crowds respect power, and even when, as he's mentioning, they're tearing down, it's like Saddam Hussein, for example. While he's ruling, there's this love, respect, and fear of him. He has all these great statues of him all over the place. And when he falls, they're tearing down his statue, they're spitting on his name. Well, they're doing that because he's lost power. He got his ass kicked in the war. They find him hiding in a hole, looking all disheveled and like an old homeless man. And so, he doesn't have that. He's not that same Hussein. He's not the same Saddam Hussein in the military outfit, standing strong, tall, and having, the fate of the country in his hands. So the crowd can easily turn on you when weakness is showed. But when you are that symbol of strength, they will respect that and they will bow to that. Number 5, the morality of crowds. Taking the word morality to mean constant respect for certain social conventions and the permanent repression of selfish impulses. It is quite evident that crowds are too impulsive and too mobile to be moral. If, however, we include in the term morality the transitory display of certain qualities such as abnegation, self-sacrifice, disinterestedness, devotion, and the need of equity, we may say, on the contrary, the crowds may exhibit at times very lofty morality. If then crowds often abandon themselves to low instincts, they also set the example of times of acts of lofty morality. If disinterestedness, resignation, and the absolute devotion to a real or to a chimerical ideal are moral virtues, it may be said that crowds often possess these virtues to a degree rarely attained by the wisest philosophers. Doubtless they practice them unconsciously, but that is of small importance. We should not complain too much that crowds are more essentially guided by unconscious considerations and are not given to reasoning. Had they, in certain causes, reasoned and consulted their immediate interest, it is possible that no civilization would have ever grown up on our planet and humanity would have had no history. So yeah, if you're always, even if the crowd was logical and rational and always looked out for their self-interest, well, then they wouldn't do a fucking thing. There would never be a revolution. There'd never be a riot. There'd never be a changing of things. There'd never be people having a general strike against companies. There'd never be people, attacking the companies that they feel misused by. The only reason crowds work is because we all go to our primitive there. The ideas, reasoning power, and imagination of crowds. 1. The ideas of crowds. When studying in a preceding work the part played by ideas in the evolution of nations, we showed that every civilization is the outcome of a small number of fundamental ideas that are very rarely renewed. We showed how these ideas are implemented in the minds of crowds, with what difficulty the process is effected, and the power possessed by the ideas in question when once it has been accomplished. Finally, we saw the great historical perturbations are result, as a rule, of changes in these fundamental ideas. Having treated this subject at sufficient length, I shall not return to it now, but I shall confine myself to saying a few words on the subject of such ideas as are accessible to crowds, and under the forms under which they conceive them. They may be divided into 2 classes. In one, we shall place accidental and passing ideas created by the influences of the moment, infatuation of an individual or doctrine, for instance. In the other will be classed the fundamental ideas to which the environment, the laws of hereditary and public opinion gives a very great stability. Such ideas are the religious beliefs of the past and the social and democratic ideas of today. These fundamental ideas resemble the volume of water of a stream slowly pursuing its course. The transitory ideas are like the small waves, forever changing, which agitate its surface and are more visible than the progress of the stream itself, although without real importance. Whatever be the idea suggested to the crowds, they can only exercise effective influence on condition that they assume a very absolute, uncompromising, and simple shape. They present themselves then in a guise of images and are only accessible to the masses under this form. These images, like ideas, are not connected by any logical bond of analogy or succession, and may take each other's place like the slides of a magic lantern which the operator withdraws from the groove in which they were placed one above the other. This explains how it is the most contradictory ideas may be seen to be simultaneously current in crowds. According to the changes of the movement, a crowd will come under the influence of one of the various ideas stored up in its understanding, and it's capable in consequence of committing the most dissimilar acts. Its complete lack of the critical spirit does not allow of its perceiving these contradictions. When by various processes an idea has ended by penetrating into the minds of the crowds, it possesses an irresistible power and brings about a series of effects opposition to which is bootless. The philosophical ideas which resulted in the French Revolution took nearly a century to implant themselves in the mind of the crowd. Their irresistible force, when once they had taken root, is known. The striving of an entire nation towards the conquest of social equality and the realization of abstract rights and ideal liberties caused the tottering of all the thrones and profoundly disturbed the Western world. A long time is necessary for ideas to establish themselves in the minds of crowds. But just as a long time is needed for them to be eradicated, for this reason crowds, as far as ideas are concerned, are always several generations behind the learned men and philosophers. I think we are in this state today. Maybe this is just my own hope or belief, but I do believe we are, as Le Bon saying, it took a century before the ideas manifested into the people to where they took action with the French Revolution. I think we are, at our surface or below the surface right now, in our subconscious, people they want more out of life, and capitalism and individualism cannot give them that more out of life that they demand and want. Right now they're filling that hole with materials they buy, with their comfort and their luxuries and all of this stuff, but they're realizing no matter how much they fill that empty hole in their soul with things they bought from a store, or with their car or their status in this society, it will never fill. That hole is never ending, because there's nothing spiritual. There's nothing sufficient about what they're filling their hole with. It's like constantly eating Chinese food, right? You eat Chinese food and you're stuffed, and an hour later you're hungry again. And this is the same kind of thing. And I think we're seeing that happen. I think at the subconscious level, people are starting to realize this. They're starting to move towards, they want something with more meaning to it. They want a reason, a real reason to life outside of just work, buy, and die bullshit that we're trapped in now. And I think it's coming to the surface. I think we'll see it in our era, that it come to surface, and through that, the chaos that is to follow before a new society can take root, before a new ideology can take root in the society. At least that's what I hope is going on beneath the subconscious. But I think there's plenty of signs that's showing us that is true, and that it's slowly manifesting towards the consciousness. Okay, we go on. Number 2, the reasoning of power of the crowds. It cannot absolutely be said that crowds do not reason and are not to be influenced by reasoning. However, the arguments they employ and those which are capable of influencing them are, from a logical point of view, of such an inferior kind that it is only by way of analogy that they can be described as reasoning. Okay, 3, the imagination of crowds. Just as is the case with respect to persons in whom the reasoning power is absent, the figurative imagination of crowds is very powerful, very active, and very susceptible of being keenly impressed. The images invoked in their mind by a personage, an event, an accident, are almost as lifelike as the reality. Crowds, being incapable both of reflection and reasoning, are devoid of the notion of improbability. And it is to be noted that in a general way, it is the most improbable things that are most striking. This is why it happens that it is always the marvelous and legendary side of events that more specially strike crowds. When a civilization is analyzed, it is seen that in reality, it is the marvelous and the legendary that are its true supports. Appearances have always played a much more important part than reality in history. Where the unreal is always of greater moment than the real, crowds being only capable of thinking in images are only to be impressed by images. It is only images that terrify or attract them and become motives of action. For this reason, theatrical representations in which the image is shown in its most clearly visible shape always have been enormous influence on crowds. Bread and spectacular shows constituted for the plebs of ancient Rome the idea of happiness, and they asked for nothing more. Throughout the successive ages, the ideal has scarcely varied. Nothing has a greater effect on the imagination of crowds of every category than theatrical representations. Moreover, all great statesmen of every age and every country, including the most absolute despots, have regarded the popular imagination as a basis of their power, and they have never attempted to govern in opposition to it. It was by becoming Catholic, said Napoleon to the Council of State, that I terminated the Vendine War. By becoming a Mussulman, that I obtained a footing in Egypt. By becoming a ultramontane that I won over the Italian priests, and had I to govern a nation of Jews, I would have rebuilt Solomon's temple. So, I remember I made this point in the what was Hitler's religion, his personal religion video, and I had some delusional Hitler fanboys who just grew up watching YouTube videos and reading Nazi posters, Nazi propaganda posters, thinking this was reality, say, pretty much lambast me and say, how dare you accuse Hitler of lying or playing politics? But every man, and this is the same point I made in there, every man that wants to assume power has to take on these tools of speaking with people. And this is what Napoleon was great at, like he was saying. And wherever he governed, he spoke in terms that were palatable to the crowd he was speaking to. I mean, you just have to do this. There's no way around it. Doesn't make anyone dishonest or anything to that nature. It's just how it is. Okay, let's get into the remote factors of the opinions and beliefs of crowds. Having studied the mental constitution of crowds and becoming acquainted with their modes of feeling, thinking, and reasoning, we shall now proceed to examine how their opinions and beliefs arise and become established. The factors which determine these opinions and beliefs are of two kinds: remote factors and immediate factors. The remote factors are those which render crowds capable of adopting certain convictions and absolutely refractory to the acceptance of others. These factors prepare the ground in which are suddenly seen to germinate certain new ideas whose force and consequences are a cause of astonishment, though they are only spontaneous in appearance. The successive action of these two kinds of factors is to be traced in all great historical events, the French Revolution to cite but one of the most striking of such events, had among its remote factors the writings of the philosophers and exactions of the nobility and the progress of scientific thought. So all these things laid the groundwork. The mind of the masses, thus perpetrated, was then easily roused by such immediate factors as the speech of orators and the resistance of the court party to insignificant reforms. Among the remote factors, there are some of a general nature, which are found to underline all the beliefs and opinions of crowds. They are race, traditions, time, institutions, and education. We now proceed to study the influence of these different factors. So once again, he's using the French Revolution as example, but you can attach it to any revolution. The groundwork was laid, he says, for this case in particular, a century ahead of time. The philosophers, science and technology going a certain way, everything laid the foundation to the revolution that manifested. It just didn't pop up out of thin air. It was sitting there fermenting. It was living in the subconscious, and then it came to the conscience in this violent orgy that was the French Revolution. Okay, number one, the first one, race. The factor race must be placed in the first rank, for in itself, it far surpasses in importance all the others. Now, he's referring to a previous work here. He says, we showed in a previous volume what an historical race is, and how, its character once formed, it possesses the result and laws of hereditary such powers that its beliefs, institutions, and arts, in a word, all the elements of its civilization, are merely the outward expression of its genius. That's even a controversial belief to have these days. We showed that our power of the race is such that no element can pass from one people to another without undergoing the most profound transformations. So he's saying, the race of the crowd you're speaking to plays a factor, that you have to be aware of their tradition, of their culture, what their mythologies are, what are their values in life when you're speaking to them. Now, traditions. Number two, traditions. Traditions represent the ideas, the needs, and the sentiments of the past. They are the synthesis of the race and weigh upon us with immense force. The biological sciences have been transformed since embryology has shown the immense influence of the past on the evolution of living beings. And the historical sciences will not undergo a less change when this conception has become more widespread. As yet, it is not sufficiently general, and many statesmen are still no further advanced than the theorists of the last century who believed that a society could break off with its past and be entirely recast on lines suggested solely by the light of reason. They're still making that same mistake today, aren't they? A people are an organism created by the past, and, like every other organism, it can only be modified by slow hereditary accumulations. It is tradition that guides men, and more especially so when they are in a crowd. The changes they can effect in their traditions with an ease merely bear, as I have often repeated, upon names and outward forms. That's the thing with America, that's with modern day America, that's very different from a lot of these things we look at in the past when they're talking about crowds and groups and races and people. America, not only is it like the most diverse, multiracial country ever put together, because even in the quote unquote melting pots of the ancient world, you didn't have all races from everywhere living on the same land. So this is literally the first place in our known history that was as widely diverse as America. And then on top of that, so now you have all these different races coming from different cultures, trying to form under one culture. On top of that, we really don't have too much tradition in America, at least for the past 100 years. There really, there's this vague idea of freedom and liberty in the Constitution, and these abstracts they keep people clinging to as very much the only kind of tradition you can really think of. Because honestly, our traditions in this country have all been manifested by large corporations. Quite frankly, so it's that's a whole other thing when speaking to an American crowd. And this is why democracy works for such a divided people right now. Well, not that it works, but why the elites use it, because when you can speak to the lowest base instincts of people and pander to them, that's your only kind of uniformity you're going to gain amongst the people, because you can't really speak from a traditional point of view, because what was America 300 years ago is completely non-existent today, and whatever tradition existed 300 years ago is completely non-existent today. So it's going to be extra interesting in our era when we have people trying to speak to a unify people underneath a tradition. It's going to have to be, obviously, they're going to pull parts from older traditions, but it's going to have to essentially be a newly manifested tradition in America. Maybe you could say it's going to be a revival of certain Western ideals and practices, but it's going to have to be relatively new, accepted by the people. So that's interesting in itself. Can we evolve beyond pandering to the masses in this country that is so divided on religion, race, ethnicity, politics, everything, sports teams, etc.? I mean, so that's going to be the real interesting thing to see if we could, which I think is completely possible, and I think fascism helps us do that. So I, I I think that is the best vehicle towards unity. I really do. But that's the big fight, and Le Bon couldn't. I'd love to hear his take on what he would think of modern day America today and how to go about reaching that unity and that common culture and tradition in a crowd of people that are genetically so different, that are culturally so different, and that are traditionally so different. It's quite the paradox. It's quite the paradox. Number three, time. In social as in biological problems, time is one of the most energetic factors. It is the sole real creator and the sole great destroyer. It is time that has made mountains with grains of sand and raised the obscure cell of geological eras to human dignity. The action of centuries is sufficient to transform any given phenomenon. It has been justly observed that an ant, with enough time at its disposal, could level Mount Blanc. A being possessed of a magical force of varying time at his will would have the power attributed by believers to God. In this place, however, we have only to concern ourselves with the influence of time on the genesis of the opinion of crowds. Its action, from this point of view, is still immense. Dependent upon it are the great forces such as race, which cannot form themselves without it. It causes the birth, the growth, and the death of all beliefs. It is by the aid of time that they acquire their strength, and also by its aid that they lose it. It is time in particular that prepares the opinions of the beliefs of the crowd, or at least the soil on which they will germinate. This is why certain ideas are realizable at one epoch and not at another. So if we're getting the genesis of what he's saying about speaking with the crowds here, this is a long way. This is a long, drawn out form of basically explaining the simplest rule to propaganda. Keep it simple, stupid, repeat. Keep it simple, stupid, repeat. And this is what this whole book is explaining to you. It's the simplistic message is what the crowd will adhere to. They can think they can do anything with this simplistic message. And it's over hearing these messages or these ideas that lead them to that crowd over a period of time. That's your repeat. You keep it simple, stupid, and then you repeat. This is your most successful form of propaganda. It is your most successful form of speaking and inciting crowds. Everyone from Illouz to Bernays to Goebbels have all spoken on this, and these are some of the great propagandists of our time have all spoken on this. And this is what Le Bon is laying the foundation to in his work, in this great work, The Crowd. Okay, let's come to the number 4 now. Political and social institutions. The ideas that institutions can remedy the defects of societies, that national progress is the consequence of the impoverishment of institutions and government, and that social changes can be effected by decrees, this idea, I say, is still generally accepted. It was the starting point of the French Revolution, and the social theories of the present day are based upon it. A nation does not choose its institutions at the will any more than it chooses the color of its hair or its eyes. Institutions and governments are the product of the race. They are not the creators of an epoch, but are created by it. People are not governed in accordance with their capacities of the moment, but as their character determines that they shall be governed. Centuries are required to form a political system and centuries needed to change it. Institutions have no intrinsic virtue in themselves. They are neither good nor bad. Those which are good are given moment for a given people may be harmful and extreme for another nation. People are governed by their character, and all institutions which are not immediately modeled on that character merely represent a borrowed garment, a transitory disguise. Look at that. People are governed by their character. Now, look at the character of the average American today. It's pretty selfish. It's pretty shitty. It's pretty hedonistic. It's pretty nihilistic, I'd say, as well. And you wonder why we allow ourselves to be governed by snake oil salesmen. Well, because we don't deserve much more in the state we're in today. Number 5, instruction and education. Foremost among the dominant ideas of the present epoch is to be found the notion that instruction is capable of considerably changing men, and has for its unfailing consequence to improve them, even to make them equal. By the mere fact of its being constantly repeated, this assertion has ended by becoming one of the most steadfast democratic dogmas. You see, we're still in that dogma today. This is over 130 years ago, and we're still stuck in that stupid dogma. By the mere fact of its being constantly repeated, this assertion has ended by becoming one of the most steadfast democratic dogmas. It would be difficult now to attack it as it would have been formerly to attack the dogmas of the church. On this point, however, as on many others, democratic ideals are in profound disagreement with the results of psychology and experience. Many eminent philosophers, among them Herbert Spencer, have had no difficulty in showing that instruction neither renders a man more moral nor happier, that it changes neither his instincts nor his hereditary passions, and that at times for this to happen it need only be badly directed. It is much more pernicious than useful. Wow, look at that. Look at that. And we're allegedly, evolving in our intelligence throughout time. When look at this insanity we accept. We think we can change the nature of people simply through instruction. We repeat this same mistake today. This lie of equalizing everyone. That's not reality. And we see that's not reality because they were promoting it as this religious dogma in their era, and we still do that today, and we see the results have only gotten worse since their time. So we can see the fallacy of it. But this is what liberals do. They'll go into Iraq and bomb them all and try to make them Democrats out of it and think that they're doing them a great service in doing so. They will sit here and in this country of America, they'll make laws to where you have to have certain percentages of certain people hired under these companies, as we completely throw meritocracy out the window. I mean, this is pure insanity. And the fact we allow these lunatics to dictate our lives just shows you, as much as we laugh at them, just shows you how pathetic we are in turn, because we're allowing them to dictate our lives when we know they're completely insane. So, who's the real fool? The blind person driving the car, or the guy with 20/20 vision sitting shotgun? And lastly, let's finish with the leaders of crowds and their means of persuasion. Number 1, the leaders of crowds. As soon as a certain number of living beings are gathered together, whether they be animals or men, they place themselves instinctively under the authority of a chief. In the case of human crowds, the chief is often nothing more than a ringleader or agitator, but as such he plays a considerable part. His will is the nucleus around which the opinions of the crowd are grouped and attain to identity. He constitutes the first element towards the organization of a heterogeneous crowd, and paves the way for their organization in sex. In the meantime, he directs them. A crowd is a servile flock that is incapable of ever doing without a master. The leader has most often started as one of the led. He has himself been hypnotized by the idea whose apostle he has since become. It has taken possession of him to such a degree that everything outside it vanishes, that everything contrary opinion appears to him as an error or a superstition. The leaders we speak of are more frequently men of action than thinkers. They are not gifted with keen foresight, nor could they be, as this quality generally conduces to doubt and inactivity. They are especially recruited from the ranks of those morbidly nervous, excitable, half deranged persons who are bordering on madness. Who are bordering on madness, right? The madman did it. So that really needs to be pointed out because it's. I mean, let's face it. I won't say intellectuals are useless because intellectuals can lay a foundation that a man of action will pick up upon and run with. But we look at all movements, all revolutionary movements, and all leaders of these movements. They've all said, the intellectual class were completely useless because they'll sit there and they'll figure out a way how not to get active. And meanwhile, it takes people who aren't stuck in this world of, verbal masturbation and intellectualism and all this, men of actions, doers, to actually go out there and do stuff. And we have the same thing today. That's why whenever you see someone who's trying to be too intellectual and constantly using words that you got to break out a dictionary to just to see what the hell he's talking about, people are a waste of space. They just like to hear themselves talk for the most part. I see it all too often, especially in philosophy circles. He goes on, however absurd may be the idea they uphold or the goal they pursue, their convictions are so strong that all reasoning is lost upon them. Contempt and persecution do not affect them. This is very relevant to a lot of stuff going on in the alternative scene today. People are crying about being doxxed and everything. Let's repeat that one more time from Mr. Le Bon here. Contempt and persecution do not affect them, or only serve to excite them more. Ha ha! They sacrifice their personal interests, their family, everything. Yes, welcome to Real Movement 101. Fanatics. You need fanatics. Any good movement needs fanatics. We need to be fanatical about it. We need to be fanatical. Once again, I'll highlight the beauty of fascism is it creates fanatics. Fascists don't run from adversity, they run towards it. That's what they seek. The very instinct of self-preservation is entirely obliterated in them. That's how you know you're motivated by a cause, like you're really feeling a cause. The very instinct of self-preservation is entirely obliterated in them, and so much so that often the only recompense they solicit is that of martyrdom. The intensity of their faith gives great power of suggestion to their words. See, that emulates to the people you're speaking to, and that's how it goes. Everything. So if you have a cowardly, figurehead, what kind of people do you expect to have? But if you have a go hard individual who's passionate and filled with righteousness in his beliefs, that's what the people that are listening to him will also be influenced by. That'll be their fuel for themselves. The multitude is always ready to listen to the strong-willed man who knows how to impose himself upon it. Men gathered in a crowd lose all force of will and turn instinctively to the person who possesses the quality they lack. Nations have never lacked leaders, but all on the latter have by no means been animated by those strong convictions proper to apostles. These leaders are often subtle rhetoricians seeking only their personal interests and endeavoring to persuade by flattering base instincts. That is today. That is our leaders today. To the T. The influence they can exert in this manner may be very great, but it's always ephemeral. The men of adherent convictions who have stirred the soul of crowds, the Peter of the Hermits, the Luthers, the men of the French Revolution, have only exercised their fascination after having been themselves fascinated first of all by a creed. They are then able to call up in the souls of their fellows that formidable force known as faith, which renders a man to the absolute slave of his dream. Yeah, that's true movement. That's like he's saying. These, sure, people can pander to your base instincts, and that can work, but to really get people ready to sacrifice for something, to fight for something, to believe in something, you have to have that passion and that faith flowing from you. The arousing of faith, whether religious, political, or social, whether faith in a work, in a person, or in an idea, has always been the function of the great leaders of crowds, and it is on this account that their influence is always very great. Of all the forces at the disposal of humanity, faith has always been one of the most tremendous, and the gospel rightly attributes to it the power of moving mountains. To endow a man with faith is to multiply his strength tenfold. The, and this is what we talk about with this modern society being nihilistic. It's, people like to argue over definitions. What we mean by that is they have no belief in anything else outside of themselves. They have a belief only in the material. And what he's speaking about here is that spiritual side, tapping into that spiritual side of man, that belief in a mythology that is so strong that, as he says, it multiplies their strength tenfold. It reminds me of the Iraq-Iran war. You had Iranian martyrs running with nothing but a Quran in their hand towards machine gun fire because their faith was so strong. You had of Australia, you had the light horsemen riding weaponless, full fury into machine gun fire from the Ottomans because they had that faith of their people and their country and the beliefs of what they were fighting for. I mean, it's so powerful, so powerful. And it's something that's missing from the people now. Even these whiny left-wing bitches out there crying about, corporations and all that. They're all hypocrites. They're not really fanatical about it. They just they're actually following the social dogma. Like I keep saying, they're useful idiots for the system. They think they're protesting against it, but they're actually protesting for it. And it's like they don't have that true faith of sacrifice for a great cause or anything. That's completely void in America today. And this is, I hate to keep sounding like I hate to keep beating the dead horse, but this once again, this is what fascism is going to revive in people, and what is slowly coming to surface. Where were we now? To endow a man with faith is to multiply his strength tenfold. The great events of history have been brought about the obscure believers who have had very little beyond their faith in their favor. It is not by the aid of the learned philosophers, and still less of the skeptics, that have been built up with the great religions which have swayed the world, or the vast empires which have spread from one hemisphere to another. The persistent will force they possess is an immensely rare and immensely powerful facility to which everything yields. What a strong and continuous will is capable of is not only properly appreciated, nothing resists it. Neither nature, gods, nor man. God damn, that's some powerful shit, and it's so true. And speaking as someone who has not mastered his will, who would love to, who strives to, there is nothing more powerful in existence than mastering your will. Nothing. Oh, nothing. It gives me goosebumps just thinking about the possibility of it. And it's so strong, and it's, once again, we live in such a hedonistic and nihilistic time that people will not self-examine and build on their character and build on their flaws, fix their flaws, and try to master that will. I've slayed dragon by dragon. I got more dragons to slay, but at least I'm aware these dragons exist, and at least I'm slaying them one by one. This is the path of man, especially if you want to be in a leadership role, especially if you want to put yourself out there and speak to people. You have to try to master your will. You have to try. And once again, there's nothing more powerful than that. Any man, regardless of your race, regardless of your ethnicity, regardless of your religion, regardless of any deformities, any man that can master his will can accomplish anything he desires. Anything. That's the fundamental truth. There is no way around that. That is the reality of it. Any man can accomplish anything if they master their will. Number 2, the means of action of the leaders. Affirmation, repetition. When it is wanted to stir up a crowd for a short space of time, to induce it to commit an act of any nature, to pillage a palace, or to die in defense of a stronghold of a barricade, for instance, the crowd must be acted upon a rapid suggestion, among which example is most powerful in its effect. You always see it in the movies, right? The great speech right before the war that just gets everyone like, yeah, fuck it, let's go. Woo, that speech, it's like, I can't wait to hear that speech. I'm living to the day I can get riled up by that speech in a crowd. And we can go take care of these bastards like we should have been done a long time ago. But that's what he's speaking about here. It's like that moment, seize upon that moment. To attain this end, however, it is necessary that the crowd should be very previously prepared by certain circumstances, and above all, that he who wishes to work upon it should possess the quality to be studied farther on, to which I gave the name of prestige. We'll get into prestige in a moment. When, however, it is proposed to imbue the mind of the crowd with ideas and beliefs, with modern social theories, for instance, the leaders have recourse to a different expedients. The principal of them are three in number and clearly identified: affirmation, repetition, and contagion. Their action is somewhat slow, but its effects, once produced, are very lasting. Affirmation, pure and simple, kept free of all reasoning and all proof, is one's surest means of making an idea enter the mind of the crowds. The conciser, and that's just how, for whatever reason, the word is translated, to be more concise, let's say, but the conciser an affirmation is, the more destitute in every appearance of proof and demonstration, the more weight it carries. The religious books and the legal codes of all ages have always restored to a simple affirmation. Statesmen called upon to defend a political cause and commercial men pushing the sale of their products by means of advertising are acquainted with the value of affirmation. Affirmation, however, has no real influence unless it be constantly repeated, and so far as possible in the same terms. It was Napoleon, I believe, who said that there is only one figure in rhetoric of serious importance, namely repetition. The thing affirmed comes by repetition to fix itself in the mind in such a way that it is accepted in the end as a demonstrated truth. And this also highlights a big criticism of capitalism, advertisement. If you're constantly being sold sex and gluttony, and billboards and commercials and everything are pushing this, it grows in your mind. You're more influenced to that. And this is where the libertarian, this is where the individualist, this is where the capitalist, they all fail to realize that. They have this, especially libertarian. Let's say if a libertarian's of good character and he thinks naturally everyone else will be just like him. And when that's not the case, especially when you have, like I said, gluttony and pornography attacking your senses 24/7, that's, good luck. Good luck building a society of upstanding people with healthy minds and bodies. Good luck. With a spiritual sense. Yeah, good luck with that when you surround them with shit. Third and lastly, prestige. Great power is given to the ideas propagated by affirmation, repetition, and contagion by the circumstances they acquire and the mysterious forces known as prestige. Whatever has been a ruling power in the world, whether it be ideas or men, has in the main enforced its authority by means of that irresistible force expressed by the word prestige. The term is one whose meaning is grasped by everybody, but the word is employed in ways too different for it to be easy to define it. Prestige may involve such sentiments as admiration or fear. Occasionally, even these sentiments are at its basis, but it can be perfectly well exist without them. The greatest measure of prestige is possessed by the dead, by beings, that is, of whom we do not stand in fear, by Alexander, Caesar, Mohammed, and Buddha, for example. On the other hand, there are fictive beings who we do not admire, the monstrous divinities of the subterranean temples of India, for instance, but who strike us nevertheless as endowed with great prestige. Prestige in reality is a sort of domination exercised on our mind by an individual, a work, or an idea. This domination entirely paralyzes our critical facility and fills our soul with astonishment and respect. The sentiment provoked is inexplicable, like all sentiments, but it would appear to be of the same kind as the fascination to which a magnetized person is subjected. Prestige is the mainspring of all authority. Neither gods, king, nor women have ever reigned without it. The various kinds of prestige may be grouped under two principal heads: acquired prestige and personal prestige. Acquired prestige is that resulting from name, fortune, and reputation. It may be independent of personal prestige. And personal prestige, on the contrary, is something essentially peculiar to the individual. It may coexist without repetition, glory, and fortune. or be strengthened by them, but it is perfectly capable of existing in their absence. Now, this is exactly what Donald Trump had that other people didn't have. And it's not like Donald Trump was the first outsider billionaire to run for office. We had Ross Perot, right? We had outsiders before. But what separated him, and I think I even brought this up in my Why Trump video, was his prestige, his acquired prestige. And that was he had a name in existence and people knew him before he even ran. And that went a very, very, very long way for him. It was already a personality that was in people's minds before he even ran for office. So that helped a lot with him, because if he did not have that acquired prestige and ran for office, it would probably went down just like Ross Perot or any other billionaire outsider that ever wanted to run for office. But since he had that prestige, that took him a very, very long way, and he used it to his benefit. The media paid attention to him to a lot more, and he completely had them eating out of their hands. So that's how you can use your acquired prestige. That's how much impact it makes. He was able to go into a system that has done nothing but elected politicians in forever, and he came in there and shattered that whole system because he had that acquired prestige. Well, that's going to wrap up our little breakdown of The Crowd, a study of a popular mind by Gustave Le Bon. A great, great book, and must read for anyone who intends on speaking to crowds and anyone who intends on getting politically active and going out there and trying to convince the groups of people and the masses as to the right way to go. So it is a definite must read, and this video only highlighted on some of the aspects of it. There's so much more to go into that involves in this book, so it's definitely worth checking out.